New Kid and His Impressively Magnificent Hat by Dan Sakharov. Once upon a time, in a small town called Remusburg, there lived 3 children. They were called Jim, James, and Joan. Jim, James, and Joan were 3 very popular children at their school. They were very popular because they all 3 leapt at the chance to volunteer as teachers' helpers. Few children seemed as enthusiastic to help as Jim, James, and Joan. The teacher, who was Mrs. Breslov, did her very best to encourage them. Jim was the first child to volunteer for police detail. This meant that it was his job to make sure that every child properly tidied up their play space after indoor playtime. And he enjoyed this duty very much. Jim would be responsible for reporting any slacking, and the child who did not perform to satisfaction would receive fewer sweets after lunch. If a child had been difficult to Jim, Jim would see to it that he was particularly difficult on that child in return, which, more times than not, meant fewer sweets. As such, it soon got around that if you didn't want to be docked sweets, you'd best be friendly with Jim. This pleased Jim and made him one of the 2 most popular boys in class. James was the other most popular boy in class. Along with Jim, as I said earlier, James was the one who was given the job of blowing the recess whistle and organizing the class's return from outdoors for story time. The children would enter the class in the order James said he saw the children arrive, which could be any order James wished, as Miss Breslov trusted him implicitly. The children who were allowed to enter the classroom first would quickly occupy the seats next to Mrs. Breslov in the story circle, and could lean over and look at the book's pictures. Being able to look at the pictures was something all of the children wanted a chance to do. But if a given child had made James upset, they would never be allowed in the classroom first. It soon got around that if you wanted to look at the pictures during story time, you would need to treat James well. This made James very happy indeed, and he was the most popular boy in class along with Jim. Finally, Joan was the one who volunteered to hand out pencils at activity times. She was especially fond of this duty, as she was in charge of deciding which child received which pencil. Whichever one you get is whichever one you take, she liked to say, and she meant it. She decided who got the long pencils, the short pencils, the pencils with good, strong, useful erasers, and the pencils with no erasers and the furrows bitten closed. If Joan was favorably disposed to a child at a given moment, he or she would receive one of the good pencils. If, by chance, she was cross with any of the children, they would have to resign themselves to one of the bad ones. So it was understood among the children that if you didn't want to have to slog through a lesson with a useless pencil, the best thing to do was to keep Joan happy with you. This pleased Joan, and made her the most popular girl in class. Jim, James, and Joan soon found that they got on with one another quite well, and that their names were perfectly fun to say all in a row. In time, they found that they liked to simply call themselves the Jays. It didn't take long for this nickname to spread among the class. "There go the Jays," one girl would say. "I do hope Joan gives me a better pencil today. I gave her half my last gumball this morning." "Well, we're reading The Great Wall of Fluff today," said another boy. "I lent James my yo-yo that comes back to your hand all on its own last week, and he still hasn't let me in first. I'd love to see those pictures." "Well, I really want a full share from the goodie bowl today," said a different boy. "I let Jim have a whole pack of baseball cards I bought with my allowance, and he still rats me out to the teacher for not cleaning." It was at times difficult to deal with the Jays, but from where the Jays sat, it seemed as though everyone wanted to be their friends, and they loved every moment of it. Wouldn't you feel the same if everyone were doing their best to be your friend? It was on an otherwise perfectly ordinary day that the Jays came to school as usual, and prepared for the expected energetic greetings from the other children. Only today, something wasn't quite right. There were no emphatic hellos or how are yous or good mornings from the normal children. In fact, none of the children seemed to notice or care that the Jays had arrived. Much to Jim, James, and Joan's confusion, the children were crowded up tightly in one corner of the classroom and seemed to be positively abuzz with excitement. The Jays couldn't make out a thing they were saying, so crept closer, while trying to avoid the appearance of doing so. "Have you seen?" one girl said, once the Jays had gotten close enough to understand. "There's a new kid," said another girl. "But have you seen his hat?" a boy exclaimed. "Yes, it's like nothing I've ever seen," said another boy. "It's certainly impressive," said a girl. "It's magnificent," said a boy. "It's impressively magnificent," a girl said, all but whispering in an odd tone. "Where is he?" another girl asked the one who whispered. "He's still at the front office, but I'm sure he's in our class," said the whispering girl. "I overheard Miss Breslov welcoming him. He should be here any minute. Oh, there he is! Look, look!" Every head turned, including the Jays, who suddenly had to do their best to appear as though they had not been eavesdropping. Jim was sure they had managed that, but Joan had her doubts. There, by the classroom door, stood a boy none of the children had ever seen before, including the Jays. He stood about as tall as all the other children, and he wore rectangular framed glasses over an expression that appeared to Joan to be somewhat dull. It was almost as if this boy was in a bet that you couldn't make him laugh, and he was well on his way to winning. His clothes were simple and uninteresting, and his perfectly ordinary black hair was cut short in a perfectly ordinary way. But then there was his hat. It was indeed, as the whispering girl had proclaimed, impressively magnificent. The hat looked nearly as large as the boy himself, almost like an oversized 10-gallon hat, only the rim was round and flat. The hat was solid black, which matched the boy's hair and shirt, and there was a thick dark blue band above the rim that perfectly matched the boy's jeans. Indeed, it looked as if the boy could easily creep inside his hat and vanish from sight entirely. "Class," said Mrs. Breslov from her desk, and every head turned from the new kid and his impressively magnificent hat to the teacher. Every child, including the Jays, hadn't even seen the teacher enter the classroom. So spellbound were they by the sight of the new kid and his impressively magnificent hat. "This is our newest student. His family has just moved into our town this past week. Please, as usual, do your best to make him feel welcome." The children rushed forward to greet the new kid, and the Jays were jostled aside by the throng to make room. By the time the Jays regained their balance, the new kid was blocked from view by the crowd of enthusiastic children, but his impressively magnificent hat could still be clearly seen over all of their heads.